Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to our 85th Right and Left Discussion Forum. We hold our panel discussions twice monthly to encourage open-minded discussion on contentious topics. We attempt to show the educational value of carefully listening to those with whom we disagree. Today, our panel will discuss the United Nations, particularly should the United States stay in the UN. Today's panel, beginning on my left, is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, a retired senior research chemist. On his left is Bryan Laubaugh, president of R&B Financial Services. On his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher and member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Charlie Aukerman, retired journalist and educator. Ron, the United States provides around 25% of the support for an organization that was founded to promote world peace. Yet, since its founding 70 years ago, the world has seen 160 wars and other armed conflicts. In fact, by some estimates, the world has been at peace for only 26 days in the last 70 years. Is it time for us to throw in the towel on the UN?
John, in 1945, and when the UN Charter was ratified in San Francisco, I was 10 years old, and I was listening on the radio. I'm not about to tell you what I remembered and what I thought about that. I can't remember sometimes what I had for breakfast, but, you know. But I do recall thinking that this is exciting. I was old enough that I knew what the Second World War was about. It wasn't just shooting Japanese and Germans with artillery pistols. I knew what those gold stars meant in the windows. So this was exciting. This was a sense of history. This is something that we needed to do. We needed to get nations talking with each other. So I downloaded a copy of the charter, and there's 111 articles in the thing, but here's the sort of preamble. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, equal rights of men and women, and of nations, large and small, establish conditions under which justice and respect from the obligations arising from treaties will be fulfilled. I'll abbreviate a little bit. And for these ends, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, to ensure by the acceptance of principles and institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in a common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples. Now, you say...
To sound like Dr. Phil, how's that working out for you?
It's working out in that I think if you think of the UN in their peacekeeping efforts is to be armed response, that's not an accurate assessment. As a person who's a pacifist, I don't think that you can stop war by fighting war.
So you
it's a philosophical point.
So you would be opposed to the 130,000 military peacekeepers in the UN?
No.
Oh.
No. But that's not an armed response. That's there as a police force.
Oh, okay.
All right. Now, in terms of the reaffirming faith in fundamental human rights, the UN does a great deal more, as you realize. A couple of these. Works for refugees and displaced persons, the UNHCR. UNICEF, looking after children. UNESCO, cultural artifacts. The World Court in Hague. You know, I'm happy if somebody can tell the Palestinians to stop throwing bombs at the Israelis and tell the Israelis to stop building illegal settlements on the West Bank. You know, that kind of thing needs to be done. There's a World Food Organization. There's a World Health Organization. These things in terms of promoting individual dignity and the dignity of people. So, I want the nations to unite for that. And I think it does promote a sort of cooperation. In the Korean War, there were 21 member nations who went to the defense of South Korea. South Korea at the time was not a member nation. So they've been involved in the Korean War, they've been involved in the first Gulf War. There have been some failures, Mogadishu, for example, Bosnia. They were tied up in Bosnia. They couldn't really help much there. But Cyprus, East Timor, have been a number of occasions in history where the UN peacekeeping efforts have been very successful of bringing an early end to the festivities. Well, I think some people see war as a festivity. But so personally think that these things are worth doing. It is both a moral effort and it is a sociological effort. Peacekeeping, well, people are going to war. But can we ameliorate it? Can we modify it? Can we control it in some way by bringing the force of public scrutiny to people who cross the line?
Do you think that the United Nations played a role in during the Cold War in not having armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union?
I don't know any details about that, really, whether that's true or not.
But I mean, would you imagine, had there not been a UN, would we still be walking on this planet?
I'm thinking that you can't tell that. I think it's helpful to think of these, how many, 160 armed conflicts since then? There hasn't been a major worldwide problem.
That 160, I will say, includes things like our invasion of Grenada.
Sure.
I mean, hardly a Holocaust.
Yeah.
Yeah, but in any event.
Yeah, I don't think you can tell that. I think it's encouraging to speculate that the UN has helped in that respect. I don't know that you can tell. I'd like to think so.
Right.
So I would be in favor. Yes, let's keep it. Let's stay in it.
Bryan, I think I already know where you come down.
Yeah, I think that Ron has made some good points. The UN has done a lot of good. I think its ability to really be a peacekeeper has been severely diminished. I think that aspect of the UN probably needs to be revamped in some way, shape, or form. From my review of history and some of the issues, you know, the UN peacekeepers go in and they're so muddled down in a quagmire, they don't know who to shoot at. And then another country has to come to their aid, whether it's the United States or another larger player. So I think the UN might want to get out of the policing aspect. There are a lot of great programs. I mentioned earlier before the show that the Rotary International was a very large player in bringing the member states together, because as Rotary we believe in global initiatives, global peace. We are just finishing up a Polio Plus project that has immunized the world against polio, along with Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. So, you know, I think there's an interest there for the great aspects that the UN has done. You know, the programs, that are out there making people's lives better. But on the aspect of being a policeman and getting some of these bad actors to sort of comply with the great and noble efforts of the UN, I don't see that as being really something that they've done well. I would agree that I think during the Cold War, I think the United Nations played a big part in, you know, Russia and the United States getting into a nuclear conflict. I think there has to be an avenue. There has to be some place where people can come to share their differences in a civil way. You might not get resolution to the problem, but at least you're being able to be heard. And they always trot out those instances where, you know, the dictator from some backwater, you know, country shows up at the UN and is calling other world leaders devils and all that kind of stuff. And so it always makes
I
for
can still smell the sulfur.
Exactly. It makes for good theater, but
well, for example, recently the Palestinians said, let's recognize us at the UN, to put pressure on the Israelis and the rest of the world.
Right.
And the rest of the world's behind them to some extent. So that's a political move.
Right, sure. And the UN has been used politically over the years. So yeah, I think our efforts, we still need to be involved. I'm not so worried about the financial contribution. If they would just pay their tickets to the city of New York, you know.
The parking tickets?
Yeah. I'm not sure what that number's up to, but it's up there in the millions, you know, that diplomatic immunity and everything that goes along with it. So,
Patty, what do you think?
You know, to be very honest, when we were given this topic, I wasn't aware that there was a big movement for us to pull out of the United Nations. And I wanted to research and find out what type of complaints there were and so forth. And the complaints that I found were that it was a communist organization, that it promoted socialism.
That's Jesse Helms talking, right?
Well, that there is no God, that the United States brings in, and you mentioned this figure earlier, 25% of the budget that they're providing, that they, heaven forbid, embrace China, that they subvert U.S. sovereignty. In other words, preaching more isolationism. One of the things, it was interesting, is two of the groups that I found were most anti-UN were the John Birch Society and the National Review. Just recently, U.S. Congressman, he's from Alabama, Mike Rogers, put in a bill to leave the UN, and he said that we should start doing this now since Brexit occurred. There was also a Utah Senator, Dan Bush, who stated that the International Court of Justice was illegal. But they are basing this on an isolationism policy, that we should not be involved with other countries, which I find ridiculous in this day and age.
That train has already left the station.
That train left, gone. Back in the 1800s, it was possible maybe to be an isolationist, but not in today's world.
Well, we tried it even in the early 40s.
Right,
30s,
exactly.
early 40s.
And and very honestly, if the United States were to pull out of the UN would fall apart, because we are such a big support. I mean, look what happened with the League of Nations when we pulled out of that. So.
Did we ever join the League of Nations?
No.
I didn't think we ever
but
did. Yeah.
We were the ones that were. Well, Wilson was promoting it, and trying to get it all together, organized it, and then said, "Oh, nope, we're not going to do it," and the whole idea died. And
I've often wondered if that was just a congressional opposition to Woodrow Wilson.
It could have been.
Just,
and there have been other things. Ron Paul obviously is opposed to it. He introduced an American Sovereignty Restoration Act in 1997, and there have been other members of Congress. There was also an incident I found in 1992 when a U.S. medic was assigned to work in a UN peacekeeping group, and because of that, he was told to wear the UN insignia. He refused to do it, and then was court-martialed. So is that a reason, though, to break down the UN? So I don't think so.
Charlie, this is a subject that you're familiar with.
Yeah, I've been associated with the UN for a long time. Number one, when they founded the UN, the people who put it together were realists. They are not idealists. And the UN is never, the idea of the UN is collective security, which is also supposedly the idea of the League of Nations. You mentioned the League of Nations was never ratified. The man who opposed the UN or the League of Nations was Henry Cabot Lodge.
Exactly.
And Henry Cabot Lodge was at odds with Woodrow Wilson. So it was political that didn't get done. He had the power in the Congress to stop it. But they set this up, and the Security Council of the United Nations has 5 permanent members. It started out with 9 members. I think it's up to 11. It may be up to more than that now. I
15 now.
checked later.
It's 15.
15 now, okay. The 5 permanent members have veto power. Now, ironically, the first one of those 5 was Taiwan as the representative of China. It was China, the United States, Russia, France, and England, who were the winners of World War II. So they got veto power, which meant basically that any one of those 5 could stop any action they wanted to stop.
Right.
Russia was not, the Soviet Union was not there when they voted on the Korean War. They were boycotted.
Oh, really?
So that's why the United States was able to get the United Nations to get involved in the Korean War. And the consequence of that was that Russia came back, or the Soviet Union came back and started vetoing everything under the sun. And realistically, I don't know that you can expect it to stop war entirely, because the big powers are not going to go to war with each other, because now they all have nuclear weapons. But it's these half-baked little dictators like the guy in North Korea, and Roberto Duarte in the Philippines right now, who can thumb their noses at everybody else for a while until somebody puts a clamp on it. And it does do, as Ron mentioned, it is an immensely complex organization in all the things it's involved with. UNICEF, which is the Children's Fund, the Refugee Fund that Ron mentioned, for example. I was in New York. I was at the United Nations actually in 1960 when Khrushchev came over. Eisenhower made his Atoms for Peace speech. Khrushchev sat there and pounded his shoe on the table in front of everybody. Fidel Castro made his first appearance at the United Nations, and I don't know how accurate this statement was, but allegedly they built bonfires in their hotel rooms and cooked chickens over the bonfire in their hotel room while they were there. That is a statement was made by one of the news media and so forth.
I don't think it would ever get past Snopes.
Probably not. But I think that I do think that to some degree we have alleviated the problems of the world with the United Nations, because they're working together. They do meet, they talk. They didn't used to do that on a regular basis. Now they have a location. Patty alluded to the opposition to the United Nations. There's a book out called, it was written many, many years ago, called The Beast on the Hudson, which is the leading book about why we shouldn't be in there, why we should kick the United Nations out of there. Part of the thesis of that book is they're trying to promote a world government.
Yeah.
Which they're not.
Yeah.
I mean, right now we're not at the stage where we can have world government. Okay, we're too changed. But it's such a complex organization, and we don't do not a lot of research on it. How many high school people know that it exists? How many high school kids learn about the United Nations?
Really?
They learn about the founding, they learn about some things, but they don't learn any depth about what it does. And it's kind of an interesting thing, because when it did try to become activist, Dag Hammarskjöld was the Secretary General. And this is one of the things that the United Nations did. It helped the countries of Africa become free, to kick off the colonial thing. Dag Hammarskjöld was killed when his plane was blown out of the air while he was trying to solve a problem in the Congo, the Belgian Congo. When Belgium left the Congo, they left it with no government. They left it with no infrastructure. They left nothing, and it was chaos.
Yeah.
And he was trying to do that. That's the kind of thing the UN is good at doing. And Bryan mentioned something about the United Nations or the United States stays out of the peacekeeping. I think by rule, the United States cannot send peacekeepers. The U.S. is not, the peacekeepers always come from other countries. They don't come from the United States. And they always come from countries, mostly from Norway, Sweden, the various minor powers that are not involved in the overall power structure of the.
What I said was that the United Nations needs to get out of the police keeping business, because they get into these situations, they get mired down because they don't know how to shoot, they don't know where to shoot, who to shoot at, and then another larger country has to come in and pretty much save them. It happened in Bosnia, it happened in Somalia, it happens frequently, where they bite off more than they can chew.
Maybe they should need to do a better job at what they're doing rather than remove them completely.
Well, maybe rethink that whole process of when we commit so-called peacekeepers that are getting shot at, but they can't return fire. So.
You had mentioned that the Rotary was involved in encouraging, promoting, whatever, the establishment of the UN by encouraging the individual countries. How many countries were there in the beginning? There are 195 now, but
That's a good question. I don't know.
is it over 200?
Yeah.
Okay.
Originally, I think there was like 78.
But in the original charter, it allowed for this, the permanent members of the Security Council to have veto power over
Right.
just about everything.
Right.
And that was not a very popular setup
was not.
from the beginning, but I mean, there was a lot of opposition to that even before the charter was signed. And I'm wondering, thinking back to the Cold War, with the Soviet Union and the United States both having total veto power over, I mean, wasn't the UN pretty much neutralized during that entire period of time?
But not always, not always. I mean, yeah, if you had a confrontation, they were on something like that. But you know, they always work together on other things. Except maybe human rights. Human rights is an interesting concept in itself. Because I've had a Chinese fellow tell me there's no such thing as human rights, and yet they all sign this declaration that there is. You know, but they pretty much did neutralize themselves on big issues. But the little issues, like I don't know if you've ever heard of this fellow, but a fellow by the name of Ralph Bunch, who graduated from Oberlin College, was one of the first diplomats who worked for the United Nations from the United, and he was one of the people instrumental in creating Israel and Palestine, the early Palestinian-Israeli thing, going on, situation. And he just thought that without the United Nations, there would have been nothing but war over in the Middle East, over Israel being created. That his efforts helped. He came back and spoke at Oberlin after this was all over, and I think he's right. I think they did kind of agree that they were going to create this country of Israel, and they kind of allowed them to go in. Yeah, there were differences. I mean, we backed Israel, the Russians backed the Palestinians, but we didn't go to war over it. They did.
Well, in 1948, when the partition was agreed to, the United States, I think, was the first country to ratify.
Correct.
The second one was
First one to recognize Israel.
Yes, and the Soviet Union was second by about 3 minutes. Yeah. Which I remember talking to a Palestinian one time who proudly wore a lapel pin that he was awarded for taking part in the hijacking of a plane that was landed in the desert. I mean, this was back in the early 60s. Anyway, he and I were in a class together on a break having a conversation with him. And then he's the one who told me that in 1948, the United States, you know, I said, aren't you worried about the United States and the Soviet Union going to war over this? And he said, you know, the United States was the first to approve. The second one was the Soviet Union. I don't care what they do to each other. You know?
Well, I had an Iranian fellow who was an Iranian teach a politics course at Kent State, and his comment was on the Israeli Palestinian conflict. He says, "I'm a Persian, a pox on both their houses."
There are, depending on how you count, 196 or 257.
A little over 200, I think now.
No, not members. There are 200. No, I had a number of 293, and I thought it was wrong, and I changed it, but it might be. But nations that are not involved in the UN, and it could be, and it all depends on what you call a nation.
Yeah.
For instance, Taiwan. The United States does not call Taiwan a nation.
No.
Although there were original.
Yeah.
Well,
The original
that,
China.
that was one of the
That's right.
biggest controversies
Yeah.
that took place that I can remember in the past, decade for China.
When I think about that, I
UN.
think about the Olympics at Lake Placid, and the Chinese bobsled, or the Taiwan bobsled team showed up, and they were turned away. They weren't allowed to participate in United
Then
Nations.
they let
because-
them come under the Olympic flag, I think. Wasn't that the deal?
I don't think they let them there at all.
Not that one, but the next
Oh,
Olympics, they showed
yeah.
up under using the Olympic flag.
I think they
could
did,
not-
yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting thing, well, Charlie can probably elaborate on this, but there are 15 nations that are part of the Security Council, 10 of which serve 2-year terms.
Right.
And then they're replaced by somebody else. 5 are permanent members.
yeah.
Do you think that there is a better way to run a railroad than to have 5 individual entities
That's always bothered me.
that control everything?
Yeah, that's always bothered me. That's an authoritative system that I don't think has a place in the concept of the UN.
Well, it's certainly not anything democratic about it.
No.
Well,
How else would you do it?
the only thing I would say about that is that recognized the facts of life at the time it was created. And ironically, all 5 of those countries now have the atomic bomb, but we now have half dozen others that have it. Israel has it, supposedly North Korea, India and Pakistan have it. They're lesser powers. Perhaps they should have more power on the at least India and Pakistan perhaps should have more power on the Security Council. I was a long time ago. I took a look at where the potential was for atomic weaponry, and one of the potential countries that could have it because they have the resources. They don't have maybe the technical knowledge. They have the resources. Is Brazil, but Brazil never even thinks about developing one. And yet Iran wants one, and they don't have all the resources.
You know, according to Bill Bennett, he was talking about the scariest arithmetic in the world was about all of the nuclear devices, excuse me, that were unaccounted for after the breakup of the Soviet Union. I mean, thousands of these things could be just about any place. I mean, Kashmir could have a bomb.
Right.
And use it on India.
Tashkent.
Pardon me?
Tashkent. Uzbekistan. They're all over the place.
Who knows? Well, thank you very much. Interesting discussion. And it can lead to some others in the future, I'm sure. Thank you.